cases be presented by me and Dr. Bhavik. Secondly, each case would be around 15 to 20 minutes, in which the first 5 minutes would be what the case would be. And the next 15 minutes would be a discussion between the panelists and the host. The third thing would be what I want to say is about the people who are in the audience. They can put in their questions or maybe some points or some tips in the chat box below. It would be taken care by the host who would be there, and the person would be the best person to decide which case or questions should be taken up during the discussions. As far as the FB pages, Facebook page is concerned, you can write your questions there. We would try to give the answers on the same day, or maybe we'll get back to you and we can write the answers on that particular day. And I would like to thank Dr. Devakant and the UC core team for giving us this opportunity. I think we can start this session. We can give it to Dr. Bhavik. Before that, I would like to introduce the panel which we have today. We have Dr. Anirudh Agrawal. He's the assistant professor at PGI Chandigarh. We have Dr. Divyansh Mishra. He is a consultant in Vitreoretina at Shankara Eye Foundation in Bangalore. We have Dr. Remya Paolo. She is a consultant in Little Flower Hospital, Angamali, Kerala. And we have Dr. Sharath Hegde, who's doing his private practice in Udupi. So, and we have a host as Dr. Komal Agrawal. She is a consultant at LVPI Hyderabad. And we have Dr. Bhavik, who is actually who is a consultant at LVPI Visakhapatnam. And it would be followed by me, who I'm working as a consultant in IQ Super Specialty Hospitals in Gurgaon. So over to you, Dr. Bhavik. We'll start the discussion. Dr. Bhavik, could you please?
Sure. Yeah. So thank you, Avnish, for the kind introduction.
I'll just like to come in for a second. So our capacity is full at 100 right now. So if anybody else wants to join us, any of your colleagues, they can ask them to come over through Facebook Live. Thank you, please.
Yes, so hope all of you are doing well and you all are enjoying your lockdown and staying at home and staying safe. So on that note, I will start today's case. It's an interesting case. So today's discussion is going to be on proliferative diabetic retinopathy. If at all in between you cannot hear me or you miss out on the slides, do let us know. So this is a 53-year-old female who presented first in January 2018 with left eye diminution vision since 1 week duration. So as you can see here, she was diabetic for the past 15 years. The right eye visual acuity was 20/20 and left eye it was 23/20. So on just the anterior segment examination was unremarkable. The right eye examination here just showed a few dot hemorrhages in the right eye and a sclerosed vessel which can be noted here. And the left eye had diffuse vitreous hemorrhage with the disc hazily seen. On peripheral examination, what was noted in this case was the presence of large NVEs, both superiorly as well as inferiorly, along with a few capillary non-perfusion areas which are seen clinically. The left eye periphery could not be examined. Sorry? Any doubt?
Nothing. Please continue. I think some mic is on.
Yeah, I just request everyone to switch off mute their mics. So it will be easy for everyone. There won't be any interruption. The left eye had vitreous hemorrhage, so peripheral could not be examined. So as in any case of diabetes, the first thing which goes is a diabetic retinopathy workup. So our case was diagnosed as systemic diagnosis of diabetes mellitus, both eyes PDR, left eye vitreous hemorrhage. She was advised of fasting blood sugar, post-lunch blood sugar, HbA1c, serum lipid profile, creatinine, and homocysteine. The left eye V-scan did not show any traction or RD. So she was advised a strict DM control, and both eyes intravitreal bevacizumab was injected at 1.25 milligram per 0.05 ml, the standard dose. 1 month post-injection, she came back to us with an improvement in the visual acuity of right eye 20/20, left eye 20/25. This is the posterior pole, whereas you can see the right eye is the same. The left eye, you can see the vitreous hemorrhage is reduced. You can see the macula and the optic now in a much better way. Now looking at the NVs, what I showed you at presentation, and comparing them after the first dose of Avastin, what we note here in the right eye, the NVs have reduced quite drastically. Very minimal NVs which are still regressing in the right eye. Left eye is almost regressed. And apart from this, the right eye and the left eye, if you see here, the vitreous hemorrhage has reduced. What we can see at the macula, which is much more clearer. And since now the peripheral VH had reduced, what we see was a traction which was present superiorly. This was a broad traction which was noted, which was more of a fibrous component. There was no vascularity in this as the Avastin was already given. So looking at the blood sugar levels which are not under control, fasting was 298 and post-lunch was 424, HbA1c of 11.7. So at this point in time, as any physician will do, the patient was asked for a strict DME control and advised to consult the diabetologist. And in view of such deranged blood sugar levels, the left eye was observed because of the traction and there were no active NVs. And the right eye was advised injection once the sugars are under control. So the patient underwent injection, did not undergo any injection, came back to us after 1 month after her blood sugars are under control. We see the picture was almost the same as the previous visit. There was no DME at all at any point in time. So at this point in time, the right eye second injection was advised, left eye was just observed. Sorry, left eye she was advised PRP in view of traction. So 2 months later, the left eye PRP was completed, right eye did not have any NVE. The patient then was lost to follow for 6 months as she had to tour US and there was no treatment done in the United States. 6 months later in January 2019, that is 1 year after initial presentation, her blood sugars were under control. Right eye had a small NV for which the third dose of Avastin was injected. Left eye had a few skip areas and was observed. There was no NV there. However, 2 months after the injection, that is in the month of April around, she came with right eye sudden onset loss of vision of 1 week duration. Left eye was stable. So right eye, she had a PVD-induced vitreous hemorrhage with a focal traction which was seen, which was noted here. If you, you can see my arrow mark here. So at this point in time, she was just observed that it was a PVD-induced VH with a focal traction. No intervention was done. Subsequently, she was observed at 2 weeks and 4 weeks. And at one point in time, the B scan showed subhyaloid hemorrhage with the incomplete PVD, and an option of Avastin was given to her, but patient wanted to wait. Further down, the vision went down further. And at this point in time, option of surgery was advised for the patient. However, she was not too keen on surgery, and the B scan did show traction as well. So in order to compensate for the vision loss, she was advised injection and under close follow-up, and also explained that she may require surgery as well if the vision did not improve or the vitreous hemorrhage did not clear. So once the injection was done, she came for a surgery. She came for a follow-up. Though the vision was 20/25, what we note here is the localized RD which was present. This was the same focal traction point which was noted on the first visit when she came back from the US. And at this point in time, she was advised for surgery because this was not, you just could not observe this very close to the macula. And she underwent a PPV endolaser fluid gas exchange. Subsequently, she had a good follow-up, sugars under control, and right eye had 20/25 vision, left eye 20/20 vision. So this is my case, and these are my points to discuss about. So I guess now maybe Komal can take over or the panelists can intervene. So I can share my views.
Thanks, Bhavik. So I think this case very nicely shows how we can use the anti-VEGFs in the management of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. But before we start using anti-VEGFs for PDR, I think the most important thing to consider is when do we inject, and more importantly, in which cases we should not inject anti-VEGFs. So I think that is one question, one point of discussion that we will start with. So I believe if Anirudh, Ramya, Divyansh can take up this question.
Okay, nice presentation, Bhavik. See, if we are, so there are multiple questions which you're asking that why the use of anti-VEGF? So yes, anti-VEGF is a good choice of cases where we see that there is the traction associated component is not much and not involving the macula or threatening the macula, in those cases, it works well. But yes, the understatement would be that a close follow-up. A close follow-up is the underlining statement which we need to understand, that if the patient is able to follow up, then only we need to consider only anti-VEGF. Otherwise, means there are various methods to manage only sectoral neovascularizations where you can do only sectoral laser. But yes, a close follow-up means there are studies which have been proven that, okay, only sectoral laser may work in such cases. But yes, close follow-up again is very important. What we learn out of Protocol S, Protocol S considers at least 4 loading doses, and they have told that the regression has to be seen for the neovascularization, as in your case, which was seen even after the first injection. That's why they told, means there is a confusion that why they had given 4. They could have given 3, they could have given 1, they could have given 2. But they told that this is what the thought process was, that after 4 injection is that the neovascularization process is near completely eliminated, and the reappearance means, because there are various criteria for calling it as either recurrence, failure, or relapse of the same neovascularization. So whether the size increases, or there is a subhyaloid hemorrhage at that particular point, or a vitreous hemorrhage, things like that. So means the case per se has a little understanding of Protocol S, but as we have seen that protocols are not always followed, and not always, we are not able to follow protocols as what has books have prescribed. So anti-VEGF comes with a very fine line of understanding that the patient needs a close follow-up. It's a very well managed case after all. So and the points to consider while advising an anti-VEGF, as we are discussing traction over the macula, because something which is called as a fibrovascular switch. So the neovascularization, if it has a fibrous component, because once we inject an anti-VEGF, the vascular component decreases and the fibrous component worsens. So once the fibrous component worsens, then you see that the traction worsens, and you may have a break, or either a formation of a tractional retinal detachment, or a progression of a tractional retinal detachment to a combined retinal detachment.
I think that's a very nice summary, Divyansh. Hi, everyone. This is Anirudh. I think Bhavik has presented a very nice case, and I think there are several questions coming up in the chat which are to do with the PRP in this patient. Now, I think one very important aspect that we all must remember is that the patient that Bhavik showed had a very good response to anti-VEGF in the initial visit with the regression of the NVE. But we must also remember that this patient in the real world behave differently from a clinical trial patient like in Protocol S, because there is a history where the patient did not come for follow-up. And so in this situation, we cannot really directly apply what clinical trials teach us and how we're supposed to sort of manage by using a monthly anti-VEGF therapy. So in such situations, I think, yes, we do have a role of anti-VEGF, and these are cases where we understand that the role of PRP becomes important. What I believe in the use of anti-VEGF in PDR is that this is again out of my experience, that anti-VEGF is definitely necessary in PDR patients. Even if you have done a very good laser, we must remember that the Protocol S itself says that the regression of neovascularization despite an adequate PRP is only 50%. So the indication of anti-VEGF is definitely there even in PDR patients who are lasered, and that's why this is something that must be taken care of. And of course, this patient had a little more complicated course in one eye with development of a localized tractional detachment. And these are patients where we must look for one very subtle finding in the retina, that is development of flat neovascularization. The patients who develop flat neovascularization are the most dangerous, I feel, because they have these neovascular networks which are growing along the hyaloid and along the retinal surface. They tend to be very adherent, and they tend to have very, sort of adhesions to the vasculature of the retina. They are difficult to deal with surgically. They are difficult to deal with also medically. And these are the patients, therefore, who require sort of very close follow-up, as Divyansh has pointed out, and as what Bhavik has done. So with this, I think I'd like other panelists to also comment and to share their opinion.
Okay. Bhavik, very nice case. Always PRP always comes with a piece of with a price of defective vision and fluid, not and the fluid. But then there are numerous studies which have shown that only laser coagulation has stabilized the condition for more than 15 years. But if at all we are given a choice to avoid laser, we would consider it, but not in cases wherein there is an advanced case of PDR. In early cases, I would rather consider doing anti-VEGF, but then not in the advanced cases wherein only subtle neovascularization is there. And we could not get the fundus fluorescein angiography in this case. So we don't know how much of extensive capillary non-perfusion and what is the severity of diabetic retinopathy. So I would also rather consider the severity of diabetic retinopathy before giving an anti-VEGF agent. And anti-VEGF, of course, it serves as an important reserve for my patients with persisting neovascularization despite laser treatment. So that then in cases wherein I have posterior pole neovascularization, especially in type 1 diabetic patients, wherein I get posterior pole neovascularization, I would rather consider anti-VEGF agent in addition to my panretinal photocoagulation. So that is from my side.
Very nicely presented and very nicely managed, Bhavik. Yeah, as all the panelists have said, anti-VEGF it works very fast and it regresses the neovascularization very fast compared to PRP. So it has a fast regression and also it maintains the good quality of vision. But along with that, it has a caution also, as I said. It can increase the traction. And sometimes if the fibrovascular proliferation is more, that time better to avoid because it can induce the breaks like we can see in this. And what nowadays in the private practice, when we see this, if I see any C-fan like neovascularization, as Aniruddha said, a flat and this thing, if it goes like a C-fan like picture, then I usually try to avoid because I know it is going to become fibrosed and it can cause increased interaction. Otherwise, I usually start anti-VEGF with the first line of treatment and definitely the follow-up I see. And in the private practice, the follow-up sometimes may be difficult. That time I do a combined therapy where initially I give one dose of anti-VEGF to both eyes. That will help to decrease the DME, if anything, or prevent the formation of DME. And then I do panretinal photocoagulation.
So I think we come to the point where a lot of questions are also being asked about PRP. Do we actually follow protocol S? And I feel that it is very important for us to consider PRP. And also one of the questions that we received in the chat talks about fluorescein angiography. So I think it's very important to do a fluorescein angiography, check the amount of leakage that we have, and of course plan a laser, whether it's a targeted laser or it's a complete laser. But patients who are headed for progression of the NVEs, they ultimately, whether it's a flat NVE, they also tend to complicate, they tend to have bleeds, they tend to have detachments. So these are patients where we should be very careful. And of course, always a very good PRP in such cases definitely helps.
I think the call should be with regard to the severity of diabetic retinopathy based on the fluorescein angiography, or at least we should have
fluorescein.
the angiography. Yeah, fluorescein angiography. That should be done prior to anti-VEGF therapy. That's what I really feel.
Yeah, even after anti-VEGF therapy, I feel that once you've injected, it's very useful to see on fluorescein how much is the leakage. Is there a residual leak or really, or if not, because unfortunately protocol S did not consider
severity.
the fluorescein angiography and CNP.
So while
and it was not according.
Yeah, Ramya, go on, please.
No, it was not according to the severity scale that they targeted the photocoagulation, or they divided the patients into laser group and the anti-VEGF group.
Yes.
So while we are discussing the pros and the cons of PRP versus the anti-VEGF therapy in PDR, what do the panelists think about the complication of field loss in PRP? Is it overrated? And because if the retina is already ischemic, how functional would it be? And in these cases, do you think you would want to prefer a targeted PRP rather than an anti-VEGF treatment?
See, to consider what kind of cases, which my personal opinion, where I would choose only an anti-VEGF, where, as to discuss, there should not be a gross traction which is visualized. Right now we have OCTs so that we can pass the OCTs over the scene area of neovascularization and see an active traction if we are seeing, or as we were discussing, if there is a flat proliferation which has its tentacles which are going into the vitreous cavity, because we know that once the VEGF load decreases, the fibrous component would start building up over a period of time. So young patients which have neovascularization, which are including not the posterior pole, a little away, in those cases, after clearly explaining that the follow-up is very, very important, in those cases, I would prefer. In cases like right now, we are seeing very type 1 diabetics or certain type 2, which are still like living their life actively, like working day in and day out, because it not only affects the peripheral vision, but also adaptation of day versus night and light versus dark.
Yeah.
In certain cases, with the laser itself, the accommodation also is affected. So we've got many patients after laser who have complained, okay, my near vision is completely lost because of this. So we have to be careful. Counseling is very important. And yes, it's not my decision which I would take. I would take an informed consent before going ahead with any plan of management, because today's world, it's not that what the protocol is teaching us, but it's how you save your ass before, sorry to use wrong words, so save ourselves before, if we land up into any medical legal issues. So I would clearly explain pros and cons, and then give which is the better option considering his age and considering the neovascular process, which I think that it would not worsen. But if it's a type 2, an old gentleman or an old lady, I would say this would be a preferable method, considering that his active life means which they may still continue to like read or write on social media, but yes, the active life which they earn, probably that may not.
But you know, Divyansh, Protocol S did not eventually find out differences in the visual field.
So as I told you, so protocol, because so we would not be able to get, as you and me would also probably vouch that getting a patient registered for the protocol itself is very difficult.
Yeah.
There are many ifs, buts associated
it's
with
difficult.
it. And then to continue the patient, as we know, the protocol 2 years, there were 30 to 40 patients who had defaulted because they were unable to follow up with the protocol, or they just wanted to come out of the protocol because of other reasons, because of follow-up issues like traveling and things like that.
Yeah.
So I guess I think this one is for Sharath. We have multiple questions on our chat where people are asking that in a private practice kind of a scenario, especially in India, do you think that anti-VEGF would be your treatment of choice, or rather you would want to go for a combined treatment?
Most of the times, depending on, you should analyze the many things before giving only anti-VEGF. One thing, check his economic status. How is his economic status? Whether he can affordable, because anti-VEGF therapy is a long-term treatment. It's not only 1 or 2 injections and then stop. So whether the patient can affordable for a long term, like 1 year, 2 years. In the first year, they may require sometimes 6 injections. In the second year, they may require more than 4 injections. And also, you should analyze his follow-up entity, whether he can able to come regularly, where is his place, can he come very regularly. And third thing you should see in the retina, whether either any traction, has the fibrous component, has this side. And the fourth thing they have to see is the blood sugar level. If the blood sugar level or the HbA1c is more than 9.5, that means the patient is not serious about his medical condition. So that time we also get to know that the patient won't come regularly, or he not take the treatment properly. And the next thing you have to also see the macular status, the diabetic medical edema is there or not, and also his other systemic conditions like chronic kidney disease or hypertension or anemia. So based on this, if the patient can able to come regularly and his HbA1c is well controlled, I treat only with anti-VEGF. If his HbA1c is more than 9.5 and where the patient can't come regularly, what I do is I give 1 dose of anti-VEGF so that it take care of DME or anything, and then I go with the laser. If traction is there, extensive traction, I directly go with the laser, then I give steroids.
Okay, so I think with this, we have had really good discussion on what are the scenarios where we as ophthalmologists would prefer giving an anti-VEGF and where we would want to avoid, keeping in view all the scenarios, our practice patterns and everything. So Bhavik, do you want to summarize with the slide that I think you had just put on the...
True. So, considering all the points which were mentioned by the entire panel, with like fantastic points which came out of so we have been practicing anti-VEGF. So basically, I have been my mentor is Dr. Avinash Patange, and we before the protocol S itself, he has been practicing anti-VEGF for PDR for many years since 2010-11, and having experience of so many patients, what everyone has summed up and what we practice in our way is the most important thing is the patient's blood sugar control and the compliance. If the patient cannot comply, cannot come for a follow-up, do not fall into the trap of anti-VEGF. It is a fantastic tool. We are not trying to say that it is a substitute for PRP. It can give fantastic results in a lot of patients who are young or educated and can come for a follow-up. Flat NVs without any traction, without any fibrous component, flat NVDs. It also prevents going from a PDR to a high-risk PDR. So that is also a very important factor, which can be seen in protocol S as well as protocol I as well, for which DME it was injected. So a lot of NPDR patients do not get converted to PDR. Of course, as a maintenance dose, once you give PRP, Ramya mentioned about persistent neovascularization. So all those conditions can be easily tackled with anti-VEGF. So this is the message what we all want to give through this presentation. Yeah, that is from my side.
Yeah. So thanks, Bhavik. We really had a very good discussion on this, but I think it's time and we should move on to our second case. So the second case would be presented by Avnish, and it is on a young patient with PDR and tractional retinal detachment, and let's see how he managed the case. Avnish, you can start.
Meanwhile, I think if anyone has any questions or anything to discuss, you can continue to keep writing to us in the chat.
Can I start? Can I start? Am I audible?
Yes. Go ahead, Avnish.
There's some issues. Okay. Yeah. I have a case where we had a 27-year-old female. She was diabetic for 2 years on insulin, came with blurring of vision in the right eye since 1 week. She gave an history of cataract surgery done elsewhere along with an anti-VEGF injections around 3 months ago. The details were not actually with the patient. She said that she was diagnosed with cataract at that particular place. And they did a cataract surgery followed by IOL implant with an anti-VEGF injection. Post cataract surgery, she had some good amount of vision, but that vision over a period of last 1 month has gone down, and now it is actually more decreased with pain and blurring. We asked about her systemic features, but she didn't have any significant amount of family or past or systemic history apart from diabetes. So on examination, the right eye, the vision was 660, the left eye was 69, the IOP in the right eye was 32, and the left eye was 16 millimeters of mercury. Right eye anterior segment showed corneal edema with neovascularization at the angles, and it was as well as the iris, along with pseudophakia. Left eye was normal. On this examination, I don't have the photo of that, but it had a good amount of PDR with fluorid NVD, NVE. I have an FFA, and you can see the FFA of the right eye. It shows extensive fluorid sort of an NVD with the disc leak, which could be seen in extensive CNP areas, which is extensively present. And these are the peripheries, which you can see there is extensive CNP with leaks. This is the left eye, which you can see there's this florid fibrovascular proliferation along with extensive CNP areas, which is leaking in the later stages. Again, the periphery is showing this sort of a picture with extensive CNPs. So we did an OCT. At that period of time, we were able to do the OCT. The OCT of the right eye is not showing significant. There is no edema. That's few hard exudates. The left eye is showing some intraretinal fluid. So considering right eye pseudophakia with neovascular glaucoma, PDR, and left eye PDR, we went ahead and we did PRP as much as possible in both the eyes and we tried to give an intravitreal anti-VEGF in the right eye to regress the NVIs. But post injection, she kind of developed hyphema, which was controlled, we gave conservative treatment for that, and that resolved over 2 to 3 weeks. In the meantime, we tried to complete the PRP for the left eye. Now, during the course of 2 to 3 weeks, the IOP was kind of not controlled, and that increased further to 44. It kept on fluctuating between 44 to 50 millimeters of mercury with the maximum medical treatment. And over a period of time, as the hyphema resolved, the IOP came under control. So after 2 months of treatment, the visual acuity in the right eye was 3/60. There was no hyphema. The NVI had resolved pseudophakic. She was complaining there was some blurring of vision, but it was the pain and everything had been resolved. And there was laser which we could complete later on, but the disc actually developed the atrophy sort of a picture. Could be due to any ION or maybe due to high IOP. For the left eye, the vision was 6/9. This FVP, which was there, it was kind of regressing, and it had a good laser PDR and it looked stable. At that period of time, we told the patient to follow up after a month, considering the patient was kind of stable, but she kind of defaulted, and she came after 3 months with sudden onset loss of vision in the left eye. At that period of time, the vision in the right eye was 6/60. The left eye, she had a vision of hand movements. Right eye, it was pseudophakic, no vascularization of the anterior segment. Left eye, anterior segment was normal. This was the picture of the right eye. You can see you can see the laser marks, there is tail, and there is a fibrovascular front sort of a thing appearing over the macula. And this is the picture of the left eye, which we can see it is lasered, but still after that, there is an extensive fibrovascular proliferation, and it is causing a TRD over the macula. And these are the OCTs of both the eyes. The right eye showing the proliferation with the traction, and the left eye is actually showing a traction retinal detachment. So we had advised the patient for the left eye to undergo vitrectomy with membrane peeling with oil, but the patient did not kind of agree to the treatment. So this is where I want to end, and these are some of the points which I want to put up to the listeners as well as to the audience. Would the case would have been managed differently? Whether we should have done other investigations, as we were discussing in the previous talk about doing HbA1c and going on so on and so forth. Whether we can avoid a post-injection IPM, what would be the tricks? Is there any risk of intracameral anti-VEGFs? What would be the cause of extensive TRDs in the left eye? And if we're doing a surgery, what practical tips we should consider when you do a surgery? So over to Dr. Komal.
Thanks, Avnish. So I think this scenario is not very uncommon in our practice, where we have patients with very extensive ischemia presenting to us with very florid NVs. But I think to start off with a discussion on whether this kind of extensive ischemia in a young patient with PDR with a history of diabetes only since past 2 years, would we consider other comorbidities in this patient, like investigating for a concomitant blood dyscrasia or a nephropathy, or maybe other comorbidities like Takayasu's? Because such an extensive ischemia is in a young patient with such a short duration is not very common. So I think we can have a little discussion on that. Remya, Anirudh, Divyansh, I think Dr. Sharath can pitch in with your views on that.
Yeah, Kamal, I would agree with you in the sense that she's only 2 years diabetic, probably that she was not diagnosed earlier. It was the first time that she was diagnosed 2 years back. That is one possibility. But I would rather investigate her in terms of whatever you told, the blood dyscrasias, sickle cell, and the other comorbid conditions which may aggravate the condition. And also, I would like to do a carotid Doppler here, because we don't know the cardiac status and the other vascular status. So I would rather advise for that as well. And then finally, I would call doing all the investigations.
Right, and we cannot emphasize more how important the metabolic control is in these patients. So any further thoughts on that, Anirudh?
Yeah, I think these patients who are very young with significant ischemia, we must look for one very important aspect is nephropathy, because these patients can have very much deranged renal profile, which may additionally complicate matters. For example, if the patient is already nephropathic, he may be anemic. Anemia may further contribute to the retinopathy that the patient has. So a control of the systemic parameters becomes very important. I would probably say that in this patient, the two eyes behave very differently. The right eye, it's not very common to see a hyphema coming up after the injection. So I think in the right eye, probably there was so much ischemia, so much VEGF load that a single anti-VEGF, was probably not enough. And these patients, because of the significant hypoxia that they have, they do require, I think, very aggressive therapy, and probably they require multiple anti-VEGF therapy. And that is something that probably I would like to add for the right eye.
Yeah, thanks, Anirudh. So any other thoughts on that by rest of our panelists? Divyansh, Dr.
Yeah,
Sharath?
sure, I take it. Yeah. So there are multiple queries by him. Like first is how it can be managed differently. I would say you have managed very well as considering you have saved the eye. Yes, what has to be done for the left eye? I just come to the for the last. Other investigations, systemic, as we are discussing, other systemic associations. She's a female, but smoking is also one of the risk factors in Wisconsin study, which they have told. Other very important risk factor is hypertension and nephropathy, as has been discussed, and again a BMI, a high BMI. So these 3-4 things. If you go back to your FFA, you would see that there are actually venous beadings. So the venous beading is a sign. If you probably show it on the screen, probably people may appreciate better that there are large amounts of venous beading. So this, not this year. There is one for the periphery where. Yeah, so I don't know whether people, yeah, this one, yeah. So for the left upper one and the right upper one, can you see there are, it's like small beadings, which you can see. So it is a sign of a very severe ischemia. And you can see this is more involving the vein, and the vein is really dilated as compared to the artery. And that's what a severe ischemia is. And this kind of severe ischemic presentation is known to occur in type 1 diabetic retinopathies. And yes, they go really bad just in matter of time. As Dr. Anirudh was telling, they need anti-VEGF and really multiple anti-VEGFs for the treatment. Yes, how you would have avoided hyphema? Can I just ask you one more time that how did you manage, means what were your steps to do or to manage this kind? Whether did you give an intracameral plus an intravitreal, or you gave only intravitreal? What was the dose, and did you do an AC tap? And at the time of the injection, did you give the patient any IOP lowering drugs in after the injection also? So because there are multiple techniques as you wanted to discuss about it.
I didn't go and give any intracameral. I gave an anti-VEGF intravitreally. One thing which would have happened is during like removing of the needle, I would have kind of went in, and there would have been a good fluctuation of the IOP, possibly that.
So,
Yeah.
Usually it would not occur because we use a 30 gauge needle, and after injecting like thousands of injections, it is very rare that you go and touch something which would cause this kind of bleeding. It's usually what happens is because of the very high VEGF load, there may be fragile vessels in the anterior chamber which would have bled. So ideally, because see, there are multiple studies behind where to give an anti-VEGF, either intracameral and intravitreal or a combination. There is a randomized study which is still going on, but the results are not out. The last date for the conclusion of the study is 2022, so still it would take time. But there are multiple studies where the numbers are still less, probably 20, 30, 40. But what they have suggested, if there is no cystoid macular edema, an intracameral works, but yes, we have to avoid an AC tap simultaneously. But give IOP lowering agents before and after the injection. Yes, anti-VEGF giving either in the anterior chamber or in the posterior chamber equally work well for an NVI. But if it has a CME, then the considering better that you opt for a posterior segment approach. And try to avoid doing an AC tap in cases of a NVI. Because as soon as you do an AC tab, there would be an IOP fluctuation and suddenly the blood vessels would rupture and then you would have like a 8-ball hyphema and then you would have had that eye gone. So in your case, you have managed pretty well, because one of the cases which, like in my early days, I did that considering, okay, I need to be careful that I should not increase the pressure, because the pressure rise is very transient. It may last for probably around 3 hours, 4 hours maximum. And then you would start your glaucoma medications with that. Because 8-ball hyphema is very difficult because you cannot intervene immediately. You cannot go for a wash, considering that if you try to wash it again and again, at that point, it would again keep forming clot and then it would keep worsening. So that's kind of a vicious cycle to enter into. And the cause of extensive TRD, again, as what we were discussing in the previous case, also the switch mechanism which occurs with the VEGF, that the vascular component decreases and the fibrous component progresses. And yes, it has been known that it takes around 2 or 3 months where the fibrous component takes over, and then that causes a tractional detachment, and that is what is seen in an OCT. So practical tips in surgery, which we are discussing, I may be of a little different opinion from all the panelists. In this case, I would like to inject an anti-VEGF before the surgery, and along with an anti-VEGF, I would plan to give a activated plasmin. So why I'm advising an activated plasmin? Because as we can see, the detachment or the posterior vitreous detachment is only in the posterior pole. If you go back to the OCT, we may appreciate that the attachment, probably if you have a wide field OCT, because you have done probably 9x9 is what I could make out.
We don't have, I think we just, I did a montage photograph of
Yeah,
this.
I can see that. So the montage photograph is showing very well that the attachment, so it has been taught to us by our mentors that if you see a fundus in a diabetic case and you want to do that surgery, your surgery would be very difficult, considering that the posterior vitreous detachment has still not occurred. As you can see, all the nasal and the superior nasal area is really plastered. We cannot intervene. We cannot have a dissection plane from there. Superior temporal, there are focal areas where you can see certain areas of the vitreous which is thickened, but again, those areas would not be good because those are around the major blood vessels. Inferior, again, it is really plastered. The only detachment which we can see in the OCT and here also is at the macula, just at the posterior pole. Yes, here, as you can see. So only the macula is spared, but you can see the disc is also lifted, and the temporal side, it may be again lifted. So plasmin helps to lyse this dense attachments and give you a better dissection opportunity. Yes, even in best hands, this case may go in NPL, but that would give you an additional advantage. And there are studies where they have proven that 95% of cases, like still the studies are not like huge numbers. So out of 20 eyes, 95% cases had near complete to complete, 85 had complete PVD after using plasmin. It's not very difficult to make, yes, considering it's not an advised drug, but in certain cases, type 1 dense attachment, we would probably prefer that.
Those are very nice points, Divyansh. I think very important considerations that we should keep in mind before we take any of these cases for surgery is what is the patient is young, the patient is one-eyed, there is no posterior vitreous detachment, it is an extensive TRD, looks pretty vascular. So definitely a pre-op anti-VEGF is warranted in these cases. Now, while we are on this, I think we'll go on to Sharath and whether what are your tips and tricks that you would suggest for the young surgeons while we are managing extensive detachments like this?
Nice presented and nice. The surgical tips, I think Divyansh has told very nicely about what has to be done and all. The only thing what we need to see has this extensive ischemia and a young patient, the vitreous will be thickly adhered to the retina, and it's like sometimes there can be vitreous crisis also. So we should be very much careful while dissecting the vitreous and the traction eye, because the vitreous sometimes will be so thickly adhered. We may need to put IVT twice or thrice to see whether we have removed completely the vitreous or not. I don't know. I'm not used any plasmin right now, as Divyansh said. Maybe I will try for the next time. That is about surgery. And coming to hyphema, just one point. The NVI, as you said, is fragile and it can bleed, as Divyansh told, even without any intervention or sudden decompression causing the hypotony. And in a CKD patients, there's a high chance of high PMI is there compared to the normal patient because the coagulation profile will be different. And intracameral and intravitreal. So we usually prefer intracameral only when there is a fibrovascular proliferation in the vitreous cavities. Otherwise, there is a high chance of traction if you give in the vitreous cavity. Or else I give both intravitreal and intracameral. So only one point is why, because intracameral has a fast, quick wash-off period. It won't stay there for a longer time, but intravitreal will stay there for a longer time. So I prefer giving both intravitreal and intracameral wherever possible. That's my side.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharat. So yeah, Ramya, go on. You were saying something.
Kamal, I would just like to add in, counseling of this patient is very, very important, being a one-eyed patient. And the chances that this eye can also go in for an avascular glaucoma has to be always kept in mind. And gonioscopy at this point would be rather prudent.
Yeah, so I was just coming to that point on how do we actually set the expectations of the patient, and what should we as surgeons and what should the patient expect out of the surgery. So any thoughts on that, rest of the panelists, Anirudh, Divyansh, on that?
On the outcomes of surgery, do you mean, Komal? Go on, Divyansh.
Both the outcomes and how would you counsel your patient?
See, actually, I'm still concerned. Sorry, Divyansh, for cutting you. I just want to make one point. I'm still concerned because the right eye, this patient came with 660 vision, and the patient was 6'9" in the left eye. So probably we did have some window, even for the right eye, to at least keep it to 660, if not better than that. So I think I would still learning lesson from this case for me would be that it's very important and critical to be very aggressive with anti-VEGF. Whether you give it intracameral or intravitreal, I think that's besides the point. But of course, you should look at the fibrovascular proliferation component there. And if you feel that your pressures are consistently above 40, 45, like, probably in this case, I'm not sure for how long they were, I would consider an Emmet glaucoma valve in this patient. Because if nothing else, this patient would have glaucomatous optic neuropathy. And in the left eye, before taking up this patient for surgery, I would probably ensure two things. One would be that this patient has at least some control of the nephropathy. Because if this patient does not have any control, or if is not undergoing dialysis, the blood will be very sticky, and during surgery, it becomes very difficult to, kind of take care of that blood. It tends to clot, it tends to just stick on the retina. And second thing I would be very careful preoperatively is to do a complete laser. If there are certain areas which you feel you can go ahead and laser before surgery, complete your laser and give an anti-VEGF. This patient is already detached, so give an anti-VEGF and operate within another 2-3 days of the anti-VEGF. But I feel in the left eye, there are still some areas, like especially nasally, where I could have done an additional at least couple of rows of laser. So this is what I feel. I think I hand it over to Divyansh.
Yeah, sorry, Anirudh, for disturbing you in between. So the most important discussion with this patient is to salvage the eye. I would not even try to give any false hopes, because I would say in my hands, it would be 3 out of 10 chances that I would be able to salvage the eye. I would not say I would be able to give the vision. I would be able to even regain back the vision or anything, because we should not discuss in this terms. The discussion has to be very clear with the patient and their attendant.
That's
and
true.
Get a consent signed then and there itself, because it's not that you do a surgery and then get the consent signed. When you're seeing a patient in the OPD, please get a consent, because they should understand. If they have time, if you have having 15 patients waiting, please ask this patient to wait for 10 patients and then again call them back and then again explain, see, we are here to not save your vision. We are here to salvage your eye. And yes, whatever said and done, you may require multiple surgeries. Yes, not one, more than 2, probably oil and lifelong oil if there is a detachment. And these patients are known to develop anterior hilar proliferation even after your best attempts. Why? Because as Dr. Anirudh was also telling, and probably Ramya was alluding to that, these patients do develop neovascularization in the periphery, again because of severe ischemia. So yes, these patients develop severe anterior hilar proliferations, and those are vascular anterior hilar proliferations, and those would not be able to remove it. And if you are having an oil inside, probably it would be for the patient's whole life. this would be the first discussion. Second, as Dr. Anirudh was telling that he would want to do a laser, from my side, I would defer to it. Yes, there are multiple ways to manage or to skin a cat. There are many ways. So from my side, I would avoid doing laser immediately before surgery is one, because at the site of the laser, the retina would be more edematous and the chance of breaks would be there. This is what my thought process is. Yes, there are difference of opinions. I do agree with Anirudh. So I would like to give anti-VEGF, and then plasma, as I told, plasmin would be my choice in this case, considering one eye, type 1, flat proliferation, and most of the areas is plastered. And I would prefer putting a belt buckle in this case, even though the proliferation is not extending beyond, because one, that in a young patient, I would not be able to peel it beyond the vitreous base, and the vitreous base is little posterior in these cases. So if you have a break, or if the vitreous is not supported, you may have a peripheral traction. Means you may have all the posterior traction, but there would be a peripheral traction which would creep on later, 2 months, 3 months later. So yes, there are again pros and cons for putting buckle in cases of severely ischemic diabetic patients, because one is that they land up into something which is called as the antersegment ischemia if your buckle is really tight. So in such cases, I would want to put buckle which is just subtle. Subtle means just you are seeing just a not a gross indent, just a subtle indent. And then I would do a vitrectomy. So there were questions that what kind of cutter, machine. So it's like driving a car. If you know how to drive a car, anybody can drive any car. But any machine would be different from any other machine. So I would not be able to go in that. And then we don't use 25 gauge much, considering our machine doesn't allow us or doesn't give us that kind of, I would say, maneuverability. So if anybody else wants to pitch in, and because we do not have constellation, so either Anirudh or
yeah, I agree. I think just a 240 alone would also be a very good idea in these patients. I think preoperatively perfluorocarbon, if liquid, if you have PFCL available with you, of course the outcomes are going to be, even if you're able to attach anatomically, functional success, I really doubt how much you're going to have in this patient. And I think one thing I would probably like to add is that gas would probably not be a very good option in this patient. So if somebody is considering patient where you could have potentially a residual traction, and in case under gas, these eyes, if they detach, it's going to create a mayhem. It's going to be very difficult in your second surgery. I think the time is kind of almost up. If Avnish or Komal, if you have any comments too.
Yeah, so one important point that has been made in the chat by Kaustav is hemostasis during the surgery, because under oil, if we have a lot of pre-retinal heme, they can form pre-retinal membranes, which will be thick and can cause a recurrent detachment. I think that is also something that we would like to emphasize. So I think our time is almost up, and we really had a good discussion on that. So I think in conclusion, we would like to say, if we have a young patient with such an extensive neovascularization, first and foremost is to investigate the patient systemically, get the metabolic parameters under control, look for other comorbidities, rule out blood dyscrasias and nephropathy, setting the expectations at a very low level before taking the patient for surgery is very important. And we should definitely consider a pre-op anti-VEGF, and as Divyansh mentioned, a treatment with plasmin to have better outcomes in these cases is something that we can think of. We should also keep in mind that these patients will have coexistent optic nerve compromise, and hence it is very important to counsel the patient and get our informed consent regarding the deterioration of vision, or that the vision might not improve after the surgery. So I think with that, I will conclude here. If anybody else has any end remarks here, we still have approximately 3 to 4 minutes to go.
Komal, can I suggest something for the hemostasis which was discussed by Kaustubh? So, hemostasis is a very variable term, I would say, because how to identify that a bleeder needs to be cauterized? Because if you try to cauterize each and every bleeder, the problem is you would land up with a well-done surgery, but the whole retina would be completely avascular. So, we have to try to identify bleeders which are gross. So, if the bleeder is gross, means if you see that the trickling of blood is so rapid that as soon as you take out an instrument, there is a clot formed over there. Those kind of bleeders should be tackled immediately. Other bleeders, I would want that I wait, I raise the pressure, and then I keep operating, and then I keep a little side view over there. Okay, what's happening to that kind of bleeder? Where, because I expect that a clot has to be formed, because once the clot is formed, I would just not to remove the clot plug, because if you try to remove the complete clot, then again it would bleed. So to just circumcise the clot and then keep it over there. So there are multiple ways and methods. Probably once we go in some surgical case, probably we would be able to give a little better understanding. These were more medical cases, and I hope everyone else would have a little opinion about management of hemostasis if we have time, probably.
Yes, I think it's time that we would probably want to end here. So, Devakant, do you want to just end with a few comments on how we are planning on having our late night retina discussions?
Right. I think Dr. Avnish, do you want to come in on that? One thing we're doing right now is that I'm just putting a Google form here. So this will help us to keep a track of people who are interested in being part of late night as participants or even as presenters. So please do fill this form so that we can keep in touch with you. And Dr. Avnish, do you want to tell about the future of late night retina?
Yeah, I mean, what we had discussed was we would have such a conference, such a discussion every 10th day of the month. So possibly 3 to 4, 3 discussions over a month. And we would want to sustain it looking at the amount of participation, both on this forum as well as on Facebook. I think it's a good, I think we have done a good job somewhere. And we would continue doing it. We would like to have your suggestions as to what sort of topics you would want to have. And were you kind of okay with the way we presented the cases? So that if we have a knack of what sort of cases you would want to have and how it should be presented, we may try to modify the discussions. And I would really want to thank each and every one of you all to come in at this particular time, and as well as the panelists, and as well as Dr. Komal and Dr. Bhavik for their presentation and their feedbacks. And if anyone else has to say something, we can say, or we can close the discussion for today.
I think we had a good discussion. We hope to see you again 10 days later with our second session of Late Night Retina. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
I think let the panelists and the discussants should wait, let the others go, then we can have a short discussion after this, and then we can. Only the panelists and the speaker as well as the core group kindly stay back. Another 5 minutes will live, and I think we can just have a brief discussion as to how to go about with the next, and we can call it a day. Yeah. I mean, can we retrieve whatever the chat discussions we had today, Dr. Devakant?
We can do anything that you want.
Because I don't want, because there were a lot of discussions made by a lot of people, and somewhere, like it was at the end of the day, it was too much to actually anticipate everyone. So whether there were some useful tips which were given by people, so that we can put it up in the next discussion before starting as to some points we can.
Dr. Amul, will just wait for a few minutes so that other participants can log out.
Help them to move out.
Just putting everybody in the waiting room. Just give me a second.
Yeah, just let's wait.
Just stop the